Have you ever considered investing based on your social, environmental, or governmental beliefs? Tag along as we discuss the ups and downs of ESG investing. Welcome to the Money Meets Medicine podcast, where we talk all about the personal finance topics you wish you had learned in medical school. I'm your co-host, Justin Harvey, and here is your co-host who publicly professed his nerd status this year when he built a gaming computer with his son, Dr. Jimmy Turner.
Yeah, I was actually really excited about this. So my friend Andrew, actually, that I met through Attend. So Andrew was the president at Attend when Attend existed, and Andrew's a big gaming guy, right? And so he sent me this picture of, because I was checking in on him, like, hey man, what are you up to these days? And he sent me a picture of a computer, and I was like, oh, building a computer, like, that's a cool idea. My son loves games, so I thought it might be a productive way to help him understand, like, what a graphics card is and what the CPU is and what the case does and the fans and all that stuff. And so, yeah, bought him all the 10 different things you need to build a computer for Christmas. We put it together. We play games on it now. Absolutely love it. I might even show an image on the YouTube channel of what this thing turned out to look like, because I'm pretty dang proud of it. But yeah, it was a really good time, man. Now, have you ever built a computer, Justin?
That's really fun. I actually used to go to the computer expo with my dad. And so I have done the same thing as a much younger man. I'm pretty sure it was like dude, I don't even know what the numbers mean anymore, because I know there's like the different core processors and everything. I'm not sure how many multiples of processing power exist compared to what I was doing before. But yeah, you pick out the shell, pick out the motherboard, and all the component parts, the video card and everything. And that is totally a lot of fun. I agree.
I'm glad that I'm not the only computer nerd. But yeah, so that's apparently where I spend some of my money. And on this show, we're going to talk about people that are investing their money in other things that maybe, aren't fun for them, but are things that they believe in. And so ESG investing is what we're going to talk about today. So environmental, social, governmental, thoughts on investing and putting money where, you believe, like you think this is a good thing to do to shape the world or to help a certain cause. And so the question is it worth it to invest in these things, based on your moral or political views? Does this lead to, better or worse returns, like in terms of an investor? So we're going to talk about all of that today. Before we dive in, just want to mention that today's show is brought to you by Money Meets Medicine Disability Insurance. And so many of you know my story, getting hosed by an insurance agent as a fourth-year medical student. And so if you want to actually not have that experience and get quotes from somewhere you can trust, get you an own occupation specialty specific disability insurance policy, you can do that at moneymeetsmedicine.com/disability and get you a quote from all the 5 companies that offer own occupation disability insurance. Justin, I'm actually really excited to talk about the show because, I ran across this topic actually when I was working at Attend. There's some conversation about like ESG investing through the platform that we were going to be working with, and started diving into this concept and found it really interesting. I do want to put a massive disclaimer out there, though, and I know this is probably important to you. So in particular, since you're a financial planner, but we're going to talk about ESG investing. We might talk about specific ETFs or funds or what have you on this show. We are not by any means, proponents of those funds necessarily, or recommending them to you as something you should invest in. So big disclaimer there. This is just for educational purposes on the general concept of ESG funds. Some funds may be mentioned as examples. So Justin, ESG investing, is this something you recommend to your clients? Are you just like off the hook crazy about this thing, or?
This is, it's one of those questions. In order to answer the question, you need to ask a couple other questions. And I hate to be the guy who's like, it depends, but it always does with financial planning and investments. So I guess I have that escape hatch. Whenever my clients bring this up, I always try to get at what are we trying to do here? What's the purpose? Right. What is the desired end? What's the desired outcome? And I want to make sure that investing in a certain ETF rather than another ETF is going to produce that outcome or measurably move whatever the issue or the cause or the ethical principle is going to advance that cause. Or at least if it's not going to measurably advance the cause, we want to examine that question. So when it comes to ESG, that means a lot of different things. Sometimes it's carbon footprint. Sometimes it's like guns. Sometimes it's porn or gambling or any of the vice types of investments. There actually used to be a fund. I don't know if it still exists. VICEX, VICEX. It's a mutual fund that essentially assembles. It's like the anti-ESG. Let me look and see if this is still out there.
So this is a fund that invests in all the things that other people are trying to, through ESG investing, not invest in.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
While you're pulling that up, just to, really big picture. So ESG, so you can think about environmental, social governance is what ESG stands for. So environmental tends to be things like, climate change, or maybe the carbon, issue, like decreasing carbon footprint, energy stuff, deforestation. Social is more like essentially diversity, equity, and inclusion, human rights, data protection, that sort of thing. Whereas governance, that's the one that I always kind of found confusing, is typically like corporate governance. How do companies treat their employees? And which I think is an important one, because governance is actually one of the ones people are like, well, this is why ESG investing works, because if they treat their employees better, the company will do better, which will provide better returns. So interesting arguments there. But did you find the ViceX?
Yeah, it's out there. So anybody can Google this. And it is a mutual fund that's like the US based. It's called US Mutuals Vice Fund.
Yeah.
So
I'll pop it up on the YouTube channel so you can see what this thing looks like.
Yeah. And I'm going to look real quickly at the holdings so people can get an idea of what we're talking about here. Northrop Grumman, so government contractor military production. RTX, I don't know what that is. Heineken, Molson Coors, Diageo, alcohol. Constellation Brands, Philip Morris. So you get the idea. Smoking, guns, booze.
Yep.
That's what you're getting there.
ViceX. Yeah, I didn't expect to talk about that one today.
So obviously there's people who are more fundamentally opposed to these things, and everything that follows. I am not a subject matter expert on this topic. I will say I've had a few conversations with people that are. The guy I want to shout out is Alex Edmans, Edmans, who is a friend from Philadelphia in the bygone days, who's now a very he might be one of the preeminent scholars in researching how ESG is implemented, how ESG investing impacts returns, how companies qualify or don't for ESG filters, and what does it all mean, and who's doing what things that work, and who's just, they call it greenwashing, which means, companies will, fund companies will have their minimum required criteria for inclusion in an ESG fund. And if you think about this, if you're a mutual fund company, if you're a company out there, mutual funds or fund companies will run these big buckets of money. So if your company qualifies for inclusion in this index or in this ETF, you can, by checking, and I'm going to speak sort of I'm going to assume the worst for a minute. You can, by just checking some of the boxes as far as your corporate governance, or who's on the board, or policies for how you handle employee circumstances, you can get included and have access to some of that bucket of money that then gets another institutional investor buying your stock, which you could argue whether or not that meaningfully impacts cost of capital.
Right.
So, again, to answer your question, Jimmy, like when people bring this up, how does the conversation go? There's two things that I like to try to address in terms of having this conversation of, are you interested in ESG and what does it mean? Generally, people want to say, are saying, like, I don't want to support Philip Morris, because they make cigarettes. Cigarettes cause cancer. Everyone knows it. And if we don't support companies that do things that we don't like, then they're more likely to go away, essentially, or there will be a financial detrimental impact to that company. The second thing that people often bring up is, like, I want my money to move the world in a positive direction. And I want the world to be a better place because of the way that I invest. And my economic resources are an important part of that. And so if I can make the world better through how I invest, I want that to be the case. Mm-hmm. Sometimes people talk about returns, and there's arguments to be made, like, do ESG companies do better or worse? I think this is still a debated topic. I think the current thinking is probably not inherently. They probably don't inherently outperform, but then there's a question of, am I willing to take a little bit of a haircut on my return in order to make the world a better place? And I'll put it in air quotes. I don't know. That's a personal question. What I have, go ahead, Jimmy.
I was going to say, in prepping for the show and kind of doing a little bit of research on it, I actually came across this Harvard Business Review article on this. And by the way, I'll put links to these references in the show so people can read them themselves. And if you have one for Alex Edmans, please send it to me, and I'll put that in the show notes as well, or on the blog post that accompanies this. But they basically looked at, thousands of studies by basically academics, asset managers, and more than 2/3 of the studies show at least a non-negative correlation. So they didn't do worse between ESG and financial returns. But then interestingly, like, if you look at, Vanguard's largest standing ESG, like the one that's been around the longest, it's basically got a correlation of like 99.74% with the S&P 500. And so, it's this question of like, yeah, I mean, I guess I can see why it does as well, right? Because the correlation's so high. But if the correlation's that high, is it really accomplishing your goal? Which to your point, I think is probably the bigger question for me. Like the returns question, it does seem a bit ambiguous. I do know that there are some studies out there that show positive returns. There are some studies that clearly show that there's not a positive return. Some show negative returns. But this is getting more popular, right? So in 2012, it's basically like non-existent. 2019, it's like $20 billion, I think, and now it's up to like, as of 2021, almost $400 billion. And so this has grown like exponentially in interest, and it raises the question, right? Because everything that you're doing, right, when you're coming in, whether it's to not invest in companies you don't believe in or to invest in companies that you do that are moving things in a positive direction to benefit society, you're standing on this moral high ground of this is what I believe in, and this is therefore what I want to invest in based on those beliefs. And so the question is, does investing in ESG, to me, not outside of the mathematical returns question, does it actually accomplish the goal that you're intending to have with it? And so you mentioned some of the ESG ratings earlier, and that in and of itself is interesting because like not all of the the ratings come from different places. They have different definitions. And so depending on where you look, some might meet better criteria versus the other. And it kind of reminds me of like, the charitable giving. I forget the name of there's an organization out there that basically like looks into charitable giving and says
Charity Navigator, I think it's called.
Yeah, Charity Navigator, where they basically say like, hey, when you give money to this company, does it actually do what you want it to do? And when it comes to ESG investing, it's kind of the same question for me. If you're going to give money to these funds, are they actually accomplishing the goal that you want? And at least in my limited research, not being an expert on this, prepping for this show, it often doesn't really do that. And the reason why is because there's this tension, right, between the stakeholders, the ESG investors, if you will, who want to see this positive needle moved, and the shareholders who own these companies that want to see better returns. And so you're trying to make two different groups of people happy, which gets to the argument you were just making of like meeting that minimum threshold to be qualified as an ESG fund, and then therefore after trying to get the best returns that you possibly can in an attempt to try to make both sets of people happy. And in my experience, when you're trying to do that sort of thing, make two different groups of people happy with potentially conflicting goals, you often are not really making either happy if they actually know what's going on.
Yeah. So here's the way I seek to reframe this question. And actually, I think we'll go here next. Okay. The way I seek to reframe this question with my clients is they say, I want to invest and make the world better. I'd say, okay, well, how do you want to see the world be made better? And what resources do you have to marshal to that end? And let's put them in descending order of real world impact. You have time, you have money, you have expertise, you have passion for things. And then you have an investment portfolio. But we'll call those like some of the resources that we're going to assign a task. If you care about the world in a particular way, like I would say the first thing is like volunteer for an organization, a nonprofit, or start one, or just help your neighbor in ways that make the world better. And if you're buying an ESG fund, but you're not helping your neighbor, I would say there's a fundamental dissonance here that I would argue you're not making the world better if that's all you're doing. I would say if you're acting locally first, like that's great. That's important. And if everyone did that, we'd all be better off. So let's start there. And then financially, you can cut a check to those organizations that are doing important work to move the needle, make the world better, address the issue for you locally or nationally or globally in ways that are important. If you're doing that, then that's a pretty concrete impact as well. Like I might not be doing the good works myself, but I'm paying the salary of somebody that is.
Sure.
So that is a pretty causal relationship between me cutting that check to whatever organization and then the cumulative efforts of humanity aiding.
Yeah. So more directly picking where your investments go, which
in this case, I'm talking about charitable giving is essentially what I'm describing.
So you got charitable giving, and I guess, you've got potentially investments, donor advised fund or different mechanisms to get that charitable giving to that goal.
Yes. So as we get further down the hierarchy, now we're talking about, okay, so Justin, I'm serving in my community. I wrote the check to the Red Cross, but I still got this $1 million and I want to invest it in a way that makes the world better. So shouldn't I then buy an ESG fund? To which, I want to say something concrete instead of just all these endless caveats, but here's where I'll just give you the bottom line of where I land on this. My personal opinion, based on the research that I've done, I fail to observe any sort of causal link between me buying an ESG fund and the world being in any measure a better place.
Sure.
And there's two primary reasons for that. Number one is if we just look at I just Googled ESGV, which is the Vanguard ESG US stock ETF. This is not a recommendation for an investment. I don't care if you buy it or not. That's my disclaimer. But if we look at this and you just look in descending order of the companies, Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, NVIDIA, Meta, Google, Tesla. I mean, frankly, it reads a lot like the S&P 500.
Yeah, I think that one might be the 99.7% correlated one.
It may well be. So if those are the biggest holdings, are we doing anything materially different? That's a question worth asking. Are we changing the cost of capital to other, to the Northrop Grummans and the Diageos? And what I mean by that is, if I say, okay, I'm not going to buy Diageo stock, or I want to buy a fund that excludes Diageo from its holdings, is there any detrimental impact to those companies? Research has shown the answer is no. So based on what we have now, and maybe it's just not enough people are doing it, and if everybody bought ESGV instead of IVV, maybe then it would change. But I just don't. I view the difference in these, and you could also, again, reading down that list, think of like deeply immoral, unethical practices by these companies that are arguably like some of the biggest problems that we have in America are directly linked to these companies' activities and frankly to their profit centers.
Yeah.
Like think about those, social media companies and like the search engine companies, and so much of the public, they monetize our attention by making us fractionalize and hate each other in America, and then getting us all raising our blood pressure.
You don't have to. Yeah, you're preaching to the choir here. So I have a polarizing topic in my world. Right, you ready for this? So my 12-year-old, she's 7th grade. She turns 13 in a few months, and cell phones. Right, so that becomes a topic of conversation. Interestingly, very early in some households. Grace had friends that were 7 when they got their first smartphone, which, I'll be honest with you, just kind of tell you where my family stands on that. It's mind blowing. No judgment if your kid has one and they're 7, but, for my family, wasn't a decision we made. You went with like a Gizmo watch early on. And then, when that became like a social pariah kind of thing, then, she moved up to a cell phone. But like Grace's cell phone at this point, like can only text, it can only call, it can only go on Spotify. It's a smartphone. Like, it could do everything else if I wanted it to. But it specifically doesn't have social media on there. And there was a little bit of pushback for a little bit. But then I showed Grace the Social Dilemma, the documentary on Netflix. Yep. Mm-hmm. Let her watch that whole thing, and I was like, "Hey, so what do you think about this now?" And she's like, "Wow, I never knew that's what they intended this for, was to make money based off people's attention, and that sort of thing." And like you look at Meta, and Meta's a huge part of the S&P 500, right? And Facebook is that's who owns Facebook. And so it's a really, really interesting thing. And all the studies that have basically shown that there is no positive benefit to being on social media in particular for young girls. And there's lots and lots of data on the detrimental effects of being on there. And so, yeah, right now Grace is about to be 13 and she's one of the few kids in her school that doesn't have social media. And we're very intentional about it. It's not because I'm trying to be like some tyrant. But yeah, it's interesting, right? But like, one of my largest holdings, is VTSAX, an S&P 500 fund, and they definitely invest in Meta, which, is something that I actively discourage for my kid. So, am I like lacking in my moral compass now because I'm giving money to those companies, right? Like that's the other way to think about this is like, if you don't go ESG investing and you invest very low cost diversified, fashion, are you therefore supporting the companies that you may have some moral grounds against? And if not, like you just stop investing because you can't, like ESG doesn't work and it doesn't really provide the benefit and move the needle in the direction you want. But the alternative is, investing in companies that, maybe you have some moral grief with. Yeah. So, I mean, I can see why people get asked this question. I think it's an important question.
Yeah. Another sort of line of demarcation, there's what happens here. And then there's what some of the companies on this list do in other countries where they're like, we really like access to that market. In order to be in that market, have access to those consumers, we got to play by the rules of that nation. And essentially, I'm not going to name any names because I don't like getting sued. And I've talked to enough lawyers, and I know, Jimmy, you have too, that you know what that means in terms of podcasting. But you look at what they're doing over in these places, and they create technologies that are used to like enslave people or identify and harass or persecute groups of certain ethnicities, sexual orientations, whatever. And we're talking about the big S&P 500 companies. So I just fail. Here's, again, this is the bottom line for me. I fail to see how the companies on this list are markedly better than some of the companies we're going to exclude on seemingly arbitrary criteria, where they can reverse engineer inclusion into vehicles like this particular ETF. So it's not that I don't think people should care. I think we should all care. And I also see the problem of like, you should act in a way that if everyone did what you did, the world would be better. So I understand like this is not quite 100% harmonious in that, yeah, I wish that companies that did terrible things were forced to do better things by the consumers who use their products. And I wish that that was the case. I just don't see a way to get there from here in terms of picking investments.
Yeah. So for me, it's very similar takeaway. You know, at the end of the day, I'm not sure that if you're investing in these funds, they're actually accomplishing the goal that you're aiming to accomplish. You know, lots of examples of why that is the case. I actually ran across another thing in another article about, you know, this fund that was a low carbon footprint fund. And, you know, if theoretically, you know, you're doing things that don't increase the carbon footprint. And like some of their largest holdings were like Exxon and Chevron. And I was like, well, that's clearly doing the exact opposite. And so, you know, if you're not really necessarily accomplishing your goals, it's not necessarily providing better returns, yet it costs more. The expenses for these funds typically is higher than some other, you know, broadly diversified options out there. And to your point, which I think is something I didn't think about, Justin, and that I think is probably the most important take home, is that there are probably more direct and explicit ways that you can use your time and resources and talents to further these initiatives that you believe in based on your, you know, religious or political beliefs, whatever it may be, to further, you know, push that needle in the direction you might want to go, than to do this very indirect ESG fund investing method that will hopefully accomplish your goals, whereas you can do it directly and know that it will. And so I do think that that's a great way to kind of frame this. Is there a better way to utilize all of your resources to accomplish those goals?
And realistically, the people that want to do this are often doing many of those other things that are higher in the hierarchy of their money and their time, like helping in their community. And so frequently this is like, if like we've checked the first 4 boxes. If number 5 is ESG investing, like, should we do it? I'm fine for people to do it. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying I don't think that these companies are better than companies that are excluded based on some arbitrary inclusion ratio that they can manipulate to begin with. And I have just as many moral and ethical problems with these companies as I do the ones who aren't on the list. That's the way I sort of process that.
Well, not to toss you a completely different subject at the end of the show, because I think it's related, but you know, if we're going to go the investment route and kind of combine the charitable giving point of view, you know, couldn't you make the argument that you could, again, directly invest in companies through a donor advised fund through charitable giving, you know, to more directly? I mean, you're still investing in companies which you have no control over, and you don't really know what goes on behind the scenes. And so maybe that's not direct enough, but is that a way to accomplish, you know, in some way an ESG? By the way, massive caveat, I'm not a fan of individual stock picking. So, you know, but you know, if I'm a listener listening to this, like that thought process, that question kind of popped up in my head.
Yeah, if my clients use donor advised funds, the time frame of passing cash, or generally the way it works is you got this bucket. It's a donor advised fund. It's like an account, like an investment account. You move appreciated securities, stocks that have gone up over time, move them into that account so that you are essentially gifting to charity the taxable gains, and you're not incurring costs for those taxable gains yourself. And then you have this money in this bucket, the donor advised fund, that hypothetically you could buy stocks of individual companies or mutual funds or whatever. Generally, the holding periods for my clients are so short because we want to get money into charity. So
Sure.
It's not like a foundation where the holding period is many years. It's like, we're going to, sometime in the next 24 months, we're going to move this money from the investment portfolio to a worthy charity. And in the meantime, generally because of the short time horizon involved, we're buying like T-bills or whatever the cash equivalent fund is, rather than picking individual
Investing.
stocks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That makes a ton of sense. Well, hopefully this gave you some room to think as if you're listening to the show, driving to work or working out or whatever you might be doing. I usually listen to podcasts when I'm doing the dishes. But yeah, I think this is an interesting topic. Obviously do your research yourself, come up with a conclusion for your own. But hopefully this kind of gave you some questions that you might want to answer as you're thinking through this process. And Justin, I always appreciate your point of view on this sort of stuff, because it's always super helpful. So if you are listening to the show, don't forget, you can head over to moneymeetsmedicine.com, pick up your free copy of the Decision Philosopher's Guide to Personal Finance, or check out the other stuff on there, the blog, the YouTube channel. Make sure you subscribe. Appreciate all of you being a part of this community. And we will see you next week. Cheers.